The life of Howard Hughes, the aviator who built an empire. Tonight's story is a quiet journey through history, made for you to simply listen to as you drift off to sleep. Howard Hughes is well known as a billionaire aviator, filmmaker, and famously private businessman. But tonight, we'll take a deeper look at his story. First, turn the volume down a little. Then simply lie back, close your eyes, and make yourself comfortable. There is no need to follow every word. Just let the story drift quietly in the background, and if you fall asleep along the way, that is perfectly fine. And now, let tonight's story slowly begin. Howard Robard Hughes Jr. was born in Texas on December 24, 1905, at a time when the United States itself seemed to be moving rapidly into a new technological age. Automobiles were still relatively new sights on American roads. Radio was beginning to change the way people communicated. Powered flight had existed for only a few years, and aviation was still something extraordinary, uncertain, and almost magical. It was into this changing world that Howard Hughes was born. His father, Howard Robard Hughes Senior, was an inventor and businessman whose work was closely connected with the growing oil industry. In the early 20th century, oil drilling could be an extremely difficult business. Beneath the surface of Texas and other oil-producing regions were formations of hard rock that existing drilling equipment often struggled to penetrate. Howard Hughes Senior helped develop and patent a new type of drilling bit that could cut through difficult rock more effectively. The invention became the foundation of the Hughes Tool Company. Rather than simply selling the bits outright, the company could lease them to drilling operations, creating a continuing source of income. The success of the business made the Hughes family wealthy, and so the younger Howard grew up in circumstances very different from those of many children in early 20th century America. He had access to machines, tools, education, and opportunities. Yet wealth alone does not explain the direction his life would eventually take. From childhood, Hughes showed a strong fascination with mechanical things. He was interested in mathematics, machines, electricity, radio, bicycles, engines, and eventually airplanes. One often repeated story from his youth describes how, when he wanted a motorcycle and could not have one, he found another solution. He attached a motor to a bicycle. Accounts of his childhood also describe him experimenting with radio equipment at an early age. At about 11, he built a wireless radio transmitter, and he later became one of the early licensed amateur radio operators in Houston. For a young boy living in the 1910s, radio could feel like something from the future. A signal could leave a small device, move invisibly through the air, and appear somewhere else. Perhaps it is not difficult to understand why such technology fascinated someone like Hughes. Machines seemed to offer possibilities that ordinary life did not. They could be improved. They could be made faster. They could be redesigned. And sometimes, they could do things that had never been done before. At around 12 years old, Hughes attracted local attention for the motorized bicycle he had constructed. But another machine would become much more important to him: the airplane. According to accounts of his early life, when his father once offered him the possibility of choosing a special present, Howard chose a ride in a Curtiss seaplane. For many people today, boarding an airplane is an ordinary part of travel. For a young boy in the early 20th century, it was very different. Aircraft were still fragile-looking structures of fabric, wood, wires, and relatively small engines. Commercial aviation barely existed. Pilots were often seen as adventurers. To climb into an aircraft was to enter one of the newest frontiers of technology. For Hughes, that experience appears to have left a deep impression. Flying would eventually become one of the central passions of his life. Howard's childhood was privileged, but it was not without loss. His mother, Aline Gano Hughes, died in 1922. Howard was still a teenager. His father died only 2 years later, in 1924, after suffering a heart attack. By the age of 18, Hughes had lost both parents. He was also heir to most of the family fortune and to an interest in the Hughes Tool Company. It was an unusual position for someone so young. Many people at 18 are still deciding what they want to study, where they want to live, and what kind of work they might someday pursue. Howard Hughes suddenly possessed substantial financial resources and an established industrial company. His father's business could have provided him with a comfortable life without requiring him to take many risks at all. But comfort does not seem to have been what attracted him. He briefly attended Rice Institute, later known as Rice University, and also studied subjects related to mathematics and aeronautical engineering. Formal education, however, did not hold him for long. He wanted to act. He wanted to build things. He wanted to enter industries that interested him personally. And one of the first places that attracted his attention was far from the Texas oil fields. It was Hollywood. In 1925, Hughes married Ella Rice. The young couple moved to Los Angeles. At that moment, Hollywood was itself going through a transformation. The American movie industry had expanded rapidly during the silent film era. Large studios were growing. Movie stars were becoming national celebrities. Movie theaters were appearing throughout the country. And before the decade ended, synchronized sound would begin changing the entire business again. Hughes entered this world as a wealthy outsider. He had money, ambition, and curiosity, but relatively little experience in filmmaking. His first film project did not succeed. That might have persuaded some young investors to return to safer businesses. Hughes did not. He continued. His next projects performed better, and he began surrounding himself with experienced people in the movie business. One of his early successes was a comedy called 2 Arabian Nights. Directed by Louis Milestone, the film was successful and earned Milestone an Academy Award for Comedy Direction at the first Academy Awards. Hughes was discovering something about Hollywood. Money could open doors. But money alone could not guarantee success. Movies required organization, creativity, technical knowledge, timing, performers, directors, editors, photographers, and sometimes an enormous amount of patience. These were complicated machines of another kind. And Hughes was becoming increasingly fascinated by them. By the late 1920s, another idea had captured his attention. He wanted to make an aviation film. The result would become Hell's Angels. The story centered on pilots during the First World War, and Hughes wanted the flying sequences to appear spectacularly real. Computer-generated images, of course, did not exist. If audiences were going to see aircraft diving, turning, climbing, and fighting in the sky, much of that action had to be created with actual airplanes and actual pilots. Hughes assembled aircraft and pilots for the production. He demanded elaborate aerial scenes. The project became unusually expensive and difficult. Then another problem appeared. Hollywood was changing. When production began, silent films were still normal. But in 1927, the jazz singer demonstrated the commercial possibilities of synchronized dialogue. Very quickly, audiences began expecting movies to speak. A major silent production could suddenly look old-fashioned before it even reached theaters. Hughes responded in characteristic fashion. Instead of abandoning Hell's Angels, he reworked it for sound. Scenes had to be changed or filmed again. New performers were brought in. One of them was a young actress named Jean Harlow. The production continued growing in scale and cost. Its aerial filming was dangerous, and several pilots died during the production. Hughes himself also flew during the making of the film and was injured in an accident. Yet the project continued. Years after it had begun, Hell's Angels finally opened in 1930. Its cost was extraordinary for the period, approaching $4 million according to historical accounts. The premiere itself became a spectacle. Aircraft flew above Hollywood. Crowds gathered. The movie's aerial sequences gave audiences something they had rarely seen on such a scale. Financially, the enormous production costs made profitability difficult. But in another sense, the film accomplished something important for Hughes. It made him famous. He was no longer simply the young heir to a Texas industrial fortune. He was becoming a recognizable figure in American entertainment. And the characteristics that would follow him throughout his life were already becoming visible. He liked ambitious projects. He was willing to spend heavily on them. He could focus on technical details for extraordinary lengths of time. He disliked being told that something could not be done. And when difficulties appeared, his response was often not to make a project smaller. It was to push further. Other films followed. Hughes became involved with The Racket, Scarface, and later The Outlaw. Scarface, released in the early 1930s, became one of the most famous gangster films of its era. It also created difficulties with censorship. American movies at the time faced increasing pressure over violence, morality, crime, and sexuality. Hughes repeatedly challenged restrictions imposed by censorship organizations and local authorities. The Outlaw, which featured Jane Russell, created another prolonged dispute over what could and could not be shown in American theaters. Hughes understood something that successful promoters have understood for a very long time. Controversy could attract attention. A film that authorities were reluctant to show could suddenly become a film that audiences wanted to see. His relationship with Hollywood was therefore complicated. He could be innovative. He could also be disruptive. He could spend lavishly. He could delay projects. He could become deeply involved in details that other producers might have delegated. Yet through all of this, Hughes was becoming a celebrity in his own right. Newspapers wrote about his movies. They also wrote about his wealth. And they wrote about his personal life. He was romantically linked in the press and in later accounts with a number of famous actresses, including Katharine Hepburn, Ava Gardner, Ginger Rogers, and others. His first marriage to Ella Rice ended in divorce in 1929. For a period, Howard Hughes appeared to embody a particularly glamorous image of American wealth. He was young. He was rich. He made movies. He knew movie stars. And increasingly, he flew airplanes. But Hollywood was never enough to contain his interests. While some producers dreamed of making larger films, Hughes dreamed about building faster aircraft. His attention was gradually moving from movie sets toward hangars, airfields, engines, wings, and speed. In 1932, Hughes established the Hughes Aircraft Company as part of the Hughes Tool Company. At first, it was a remarkably small operation compared with the aerospace corporation it would later become. The company began in rented space in a Lockheed hangar in Burbank, California. Its initial purpose was closely connected to Hughes's personal interest in aviation. He wanted a racing airplane, not simply an existing aircraft modified for speed. He wanted something designed specifically to move efficiently through the air. The result was the Hughes H-1 Racer. To understand why this mattered, it helps to remember what aviation represented during the 1930s. Air travel was advancing rapidly, but aircraft design still had enormous room for improvement. Engineers were experimenting with stronger structures, better engines, improved propellers, retractable landing gear, smoother surfaces, and more aerodynamic shapes. Every unnecessary piece of drag mattered. Every improvement could mean additional speed. The H-1 was built with these ideas in mind. Its surfaces were carefully streamlined. Rivets and joints were made as smooth as possible. Its landing gear could retract rather than remain exposed beneath the aircraft. In September 1935, Hughes climbed into the H-1 and attempted to set a new landplane speed record. He reached approximately 352 miles per hour. At the end of the run, the aircraft ran out of fuel, and Hughes made an emergency landing. He survived, and the record stood. It was another moment in which Hughes combined engineering, personal risk, and publicity. He was not merely financing the airplane, he was flying it. That distinction mattered to the way Americans saw him. Industrialists usually remained in offices. Movie producers usually remained behind cameras. Howard Hughes climbed into experimental aircraft. The H-1 was modified again. In January 1937, Hughes flew it from Los Angeles to Newark, New Jersey. The flight took roughly 7.5 hours and established a new transcontinental speed record. Today, a non-stop flight across the continental United States is ordinary. In the 1930s, crossing the country at such speed represented a dramatic demonstration of how quickly aviation was developing. Hughes was becoming one of America's most celebrated pilots. Then he planned something larger, a flight around the world. The idea had both symbolic and practical significance. Long-distance aviation was becoming increasingly important. Better aircraft, navigation systems, weather information, radio equipment, and international routes suggested a future in which the world might become much smaller. Hughes wanted to demonstrate what modern American aviation technology could accomplish. In July 1938, he and a crew of 4 departed New York in a Lockheed 14 Super Electra. The aircraft carried advanced communications and navigation equipment for its time. The route took them across the Atlantic to Paris, then eastward through Moscow, Omsk, and Yakutsk. From there they continued toward Alaska, then across North America, before returning to New York. The entire journey took a little under 4 days. 3 days, 19 hours, and a little over 17 minutes according to widely cited records. The previous round-the-world record had taken nearly 8 days. Hughes and his crew had cut that time roughly in half. When they returned, they were greeted as heroes. New York gave Hughes a ticker tape parade. Crowds filled the streets. Paper drifted from windows above. Photographers followed him. His face appeared in newspapers. For a man who would one day become famous for disappearing from public view, it is worth remembering how extraordinarily public Howard Hughes once was. In 1938, he was not hiding behind closed curtains. He was standing before enormous crowds. He was being celebrated as a symbol of modern aviation. The flight brought Hughes important aviation honors. He received the Collier Trophy and another Harmon Trophy, and his aviation achievements were recognized by the United States Congress. A special Congressional Gold Medal was authorized in recognition of his contributions to aviation. Yet Hughes's influence on commercial flying was not limited to record-setting flights. He also became deeply involved with Transcontinental and Western Air, later known as Trans World Airlines, or TWA. Hughes saw a future in long-distance passenger aviation. He became a major shareholder and an important force behind the airline's expansion. One aircraft in particular became closely connected with this vision: the Lockheed Constellation. With its distinctive triple tail and graceful curved fuselage, the Constellation became one of the most recognizable passenger aircraft of the mid-20th century. Hughes and TWA President Jack Fry worked with Lockheed on plans for a fast, long-range airliner. Hughes personally financed a large order for the aircraft. The Constellation eventually helped TWA operate long-distance routes across the United States and across the Atlantic. Imagine for a moment what international aviation still meant during these years. Crossing an ocean by air was no longer merely the dream of adventurers. It was becoming a business. Airlines were beginning to connect cities that had once required days or weeks of travel. Passengers could imagine breakfast in one part of the country and dinner far away. The planet itself seemed to be shrinking, and Howard Hughes wanted to be part of that transformation. Then came the Second World War. Aircraft technology became strategically important on a scale never before seen. American manufacturers expanded rapidly. Southern California became one of the great centers of wartime aircraft production. Companies such as Douglas, Lockheed, North American, and others employed enormous numbers of workers. Hughes aircraft was much smaller than some of these established manufacturers, but Hughes wanted a place in military aviation as well. One of the company's experimental projects was the D-2, a twin-engine aircraft that eventually contributed to the development of the XF-11 reconnaissance aircraft. Another project became much more famous. It began not with Hughes, but with industrialist Henry Kaiser. German submarines were sinking Allied shipping in the Atlantic. Kaiser imagined an enormous transport aircraft capable of carrying troops and equipment across the ocean above the submarines. Because wartime restrictions made metals such as aluminum especially valuable, the aircraft would use wood extensively. Kaiser joined with Hughes on the project. The idea was extraordinary. The aircraft would be a gigantic flying boat. Its wingspan would be wider than that of any aircraft then built. Its dimensions were difficult to comprehend. Building it would require new facilities, new methods, and enormous amounts of engineering work. The government originally contracted for several aircraft, but the project fell behind schedule. Kaiser eventually withdrew. Hughes continued. The aircraft became officially known as the H-4 Hercules. The press gave it another name, the Spruce Goose. Hughes disliked that nickname, and technically, it was misleading. The aircraft was constructed mainly from birch rather than spruce, but the nickname remained. Building the Hercules became one of the longest and most controversial episodes of Hughes's career. The war moved faster than the project. Deadlines passed. Costs increased. By the time the aircraft was ready, the Second World War was over. Critics saw the giant wooden flying boat as an expensive failure. The government had spent millions of dollars. The aircraft had never carried troops across the Atlantic. Questions were asked about Hughes's military contracts, his management, and the use of public money. In 1947, Hughes appeared before a United States Senate investigating committee. The hearings received enormous public attention. Once again, Howard Hughes was at the center of a spectacle. But this time, the atmosphere was very different from the celebration after his round-the-world flight. He was defending himself and his company. The giant aircraft became a symbol of the dispute. Critics suggested it might never fly. Hughes was determined to prove otherwise. In November 1947, the H-4 Hercules was taken onto the water at Long Beach, California, for what was officially expected to be a taxi test. Hughes sat at the controls. The enormous aircraft moved across the harbor. Then, for a brief moment, it rose. The Hercules flew roughly a mile, staying low above the water before landing again. It never flew a second time. From one point of view, its critics were correct. The Hercules never became the practical military transport originally imagined. It arrived too late. It was never produced in numbers. It never entered ordinary service. But from Hughes's point of view, something important had been proven. The airplane had flown. For years afterward, he kept it carefully maintained. Perhaps the flight represented something larger for him. A project that had been mocked as impossible had, however briefly, left the surface of the water. The Hercules story is so famous that it can overshadow another aircraft project that affected Hughes much more personally: the XF-11. The aircraft was designed for long-range photographic reconnaissance. On July 7, 1946, Hughes took the first prototype on a test flight over Southern California. Something went badly wrong. A propeller malfunction created severe control problems. Hughes attempted to bring the damaged aircraft down. The XF-11 crashed into a residential area of Beverly Hills. Several houses were damaged. The aircraft caught fire. Hughes survived, but he suffered major injuries. He had broken ribs and other serious injuries to his chest and body, along with burns. For a time, there was uncertainty over whether he would survive. He did survive, but the consequences remained with him. Historical accounts describe chronic pain following the crash. Pain medication became part of his life. Some biographers and historians see the accident as an important turning point in his physical decline and later dependence on medication. It would be too simple, however, to say that one crash suddenly transformed the public Howard Hughes into the private Howard Hughes. His later isolation developed over time. His habits and anxieties had earlier roots. He had already shown unusual tendencies toward control, secrecy, perfectionism, and concerns about contamination. Still, the physical pain that followed the crash added another burden. For a person whose identity had been so closely tied to movement, flying, speed, and control, Serious physical injury must have represented a profound change. Yet even after the accident, Hughes continued working in aviation. In April 1947, he returned to the XF-11 and completed a successful flight in a second aircraft. The pilot had survived the crash, and once again, he went back into the sky. During the post-war years, Hughes' aircraft began changing. Its future would not depend mainly on building airplanes with Howard Hughes personally sitting at the controls. The company increasingly moved into electronics, radar, guided missiles, communications, and technologies associated with the emerging aerospace age. Talented engineers and scientists joined the organization. Among them were Simon Ramo and Dean Wooldridge, who became important figures in American electronics and defense technology. Hughes aircraft worked on radar-guided systems and missiles. The Falcon air-to-air missile became one of its notable projects. The company's research laboratories attracted highly trained scientists and engineers. By the 1950s, Hughes aircraft had become an important American defense contractor. The transformation is striking. What had begun in 1932 and rented hangar space to build a racing airplane evolved into a large technological organization working on some of the most advanced systems of the Cold War: radar, missiles, electronics, spacecraft, satellite technology. Later descendants of the Hughes aerospace businesses would contribute to communications and space technology far beyond Hughes's own lifetime. Yet Howard Hughes himself was becoming increasingly detached from the ordinary management of the company. His relationship with senior managers became difficult. He could be demanding and controlling. Executives sometimes struggled with delayed decisions and his reluctance to delegate. In the early 1950s, several important managers left. Government officials worried about the stability of a company responsible for major defense contracts. Eventually, Hughes stepped away from direct control of much of the aircraft operation. And that led to one of the most unusual parts of his legacy: a medical research institute. The idea was not entirely new. As a young man, Hughes had already expressed an interest in creating an organization devoted to medical research. In 1953, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute was established. Hughes transferred his ownership of Hughes aircraft to the institute. The arrangement was complicated and later attracted scrutiny from tax authorities. But over time, the institute would become something much larger than the circumstances of its creation. The Howard Hughes Medical Institute eventually developed into one of the world's major private supporters of biomedical research. Years after Hughes died, the institute sold Hughes aircraft to General Motors for billions of dollars. The proceeds dramatically expanded its resources. Scientists supported by the institute have worked across areas of biology, genetics, neuroscience, medicine, and related fields. There is an interesting symmetry in this part of the story. Howard Hughes's fortune began with a machine designed to drill through rock. That money helped finance movies and airplanes. The aircraft business grew into a defense and electronics company. Ownership of that company eventually supported an institution devoted to understanding living systems. The path was anything but direct. Yet more than a century after Hughes's birth, the medical institute bearing his name remains one of the most significant parts of his legacy. Hughes, meanwhile, remained interested in Hollywood. In 1948, he gained control of RKO Pictures. At the time, RKO was one of Hollywood's major studios. It had produced celebrated films and worked with some of the most important actors, directors, writers, and technicians in the business. Owning a major studio might have seemed like the natural culmination of Hughes's early Hollywood ambitions. Instead, his ownership became turbulent. Production slowed, members challenged repeatedly. Hughes became intensely involved in decisions about personnel and films. Political tensions also affected the movie industry during the early Cold War period, as investigations into alleged communist influence created fear throughout Hollywood. RKO struggled under Hughes's ownership. Eventually, he sold the company. The studio declined, and its original production operations came to an end during the 1950s. In a sense, Hughes's relationship with cinema had come full circle. As a young man, he had arrived in Hollywood as an outsider and successfully forced his way into the business. 2 decades later, he controlled one of its major studios. But control did not produce stability. That pattern would appear more than once in his life. Hughes could be extraordinarily effective when pursuing a specific technical goal: a faster airplane, a difficult flight, a spectacular movie sequence. But large organizations require continuous decisions, delegation, trust, and predictable management. Those were not always his strengths. His relationship with TWA became another example of enormous ambition followed by conflict. Hughes had helped push the airline toward advanced, long-range aircraft. The Lockheed Constellation had given TWA a powerful place in post-war passenger aviation. But the airline industry was changing again. The jet age was arriving. Boeing developed the 707. Douglas developed the DC-8. Major airlines began preparing for jet service. Hughes hesitated over how TWA should respond. He considered alternative designs and pursued ideas for aircraft that might outperform the available jets. But time mattered. Competitors were ordering aircraft. Financing became increasingly complicated. TWA required enormous sums of money to modernize. The relationship between Hughes and the airline deteriorated into legal and financial conflict. Eventually, he lost control of TWA. In 1966, Hughes was forced to sell his shares. The sale brought him hundreds of millions of dollars. He was richer in cash than ever. Yet the airline that had once represented his vision of long-distance aviation was no longer his. Perhaps that is one of the quieter themes of Hughes's life. He accumulated extraordinary control over businesses, airplanes, studios, property, and money. But control itself was always temporary. Companies changed. Industries changed. People left. Technology moved forward. Even great fortunes could not make time stand still. The late 1950s, the public Howard Hughes was becoming increasingly difficult to find. In 1957, he married actress Jean Peters. Unlike many of Hughes's earlier relationships, their marriage was kept relatively private. But Hughes's own lifestyle was becoming more isolated. Around 1958, accounts describe a severe period of withdrawal. He spent long stretches in rooms watching movies. He became increasingly concerned with cleanliness and contamination. Instructions to employees could become extraordinarily detailed. Ordinary actions might require complicated routines. Hostility could be handled with tissues. Food preparation could become subject to precise procedures. Doors, containers, clothing, and rooms could become sources of anxiety. Modern discussions of Hughes often describe obsessive-compulsive disorder as an important part of his later life. Historical diagnosis is always difficult, particularly when a person is no longer alive. But the patterns described by those around him strongly suggest severe obsessive and compulsive behavior. His physical pain also continued. So did his use of pain medication, and his hearing deteriorated. The glamorous public figure of the 1930s gradually disappeared. There were fewer photographs, fewer public appearances, fewer direct conversations with outsiders. People began talking about Howard Hughes without actually seeing Howard Hughes. And this absence made him even more fascinating. It is easy to forget how strange this must have seemed at the time. Hughes was not a forgotten retired businessman. He was one of the richest people in the world. He controlled important companies. His financial decisions affected thousands of employees. His name was connected with aviation, Hollywood, defense technology, airlines, and real estate. Yet almost no one outside a small circle saw him. Imagine if one of the world's most famous billionaires suddenly stopped appearing in public. No interviews, no photographs, no public speeches, no ordinary business meetings. Only messages passed through assistants and executives. Rumors would naturally grow. And that is exactly what happened around Hughes. Some people wondered whether he was seriously ill. Others wondered whether he was mentally capable of controlling his companies. Some even wondered whether he was still alive. His invisibility became part of his power, but it also made him dependent on the small group of people who had access to him. Increasingly, Hughes managed his world through written instructions and intermediaries. His business empire remained enormous. His personal world became remarkably small. Then, in November 1966, Hughes arrived in Las Vegas. He did not arrive like the glamorous celebrity who had once been welcomed by ticker tape parades. According to the PBS American Experience account, Hughes arrived by private railroad car on Thanksgiving Day. He was moved discreetly to the Desert Inn Hotel. His entourage occupied rooms on the upper floors. Hughes settled into the penthouse, and then he stayed. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The hotel eventually wanted its rooms back for other guests. Hughes had another solution. He bought the hotel. It sounds almost like a story invented to demonstrate the possibilities of extreme wealth. A hotel asks a guest to leave. The guest buys the hotel. But in Hughes's case, it became the beginning of something much larger. He started purchasing major properties in Las Vegas. The Desert Inn, the Sands, the Frontier, the Castaways, the Silver Slipper, the Landmark, land, mining claims, other businesses, a local television station. By the end of the decade, Hughes had become one of the most powerful private economic forces in Nevada. And remarkably, he conducted this expansion while rarely, if ever, leaving his rooms. Las Vegas in the 1960s occupied an unusual place in the American imagination. It was famous for gambling, entertainment, neon lights, casinos, performers, and quick marriages. But it was also associated in the public mind with organized crime. Many major casinos had connections, direct or indirect, with figures associated with organized criminal networks. Government investigations had drawn attention to those relationships. Hughes represented something different. Whatever his personal eccentricities, he was viewed as a legitimate national businessman. He was associated with aerospace technology, airlines, industry, and enormous established wealth. His arrival in Las Vegas, therefore, had an effect that reached beyond the properties he purchased. PBS historians have described Hughes as an important transitional figure in the city's movement toward corporate ownership. Nevada changed its laws in ways that made corporate investment in casinos easier. Large corporations increasingly entered the resort business. Las Vegas gradually shifted toward the modern corporate model that would dominate in later decades. Hughes alone did not create that transformation. Many economic, political, and social forces were involved. But his presence helped demonstrate that major, publicly respectable capital could enter the casino industry. The reclusive billionaire, invisible behind the curtains of the Desert Inn, was helping change the image of an entire city. There is a peculiar contradiction in Hughes's Las Vegas years. Outside his rooms was one of the brightest cities on earth. The Strip glowed with enormous electric signs. Casino floors were filled with sound. Musicians performed. Restaurants stayed open late. Cars moved continuously along Las Vegas Boulevard. Tourists came from across the United States. Inside Hughes's rooms, the curtains remained closed. Historical accounts say he rarely left the suite. His environment was controlled by a small staff. Business decisions moved outward through memos and intermediaries. Profit pipes were purchased. Millions of dollars changed hands. Thousands of people worked for enterprises ultimately controlled by a man they never saw. Some stories about this period became exaggerated over time. Hughes attracted legends almost automatically. One famous story claimed that he purchased the Silver Slipper Casino because its rotating neon sign bothered him through his bedroom window. Researchers have questioned whether that explanation is accurate. With Hughes, separating documented history from colorful legend can sometimes be difficult. And perhaps that itself tells us something about his reputation. When someone becomes mysterious enough, almost any unusual story begins to sound possible. For 4 years, Hughes remained in Las Vegas. During that period, he became Nevada's largest private employer and one of its largest property owners. Yet his physical condition continued to decline. He ate poorly. He remained dependent on medications for pain. His daily routines became increasingly restrictive. His contact with the outside world was filtered through aids. In November 1970, exactly 4 years after his arrival, Hughes left Las Vegas. Again, the departure was discreet. He was taken from the Desert Inn and flown to the Bahamas. He would never return to Las Vegas. His life now became almost nomadic. But it was a peculiar kind of travel. Earlier in life, Hughes had moved because he wanted to see how quickly an airplane could cross a continent or circle the world. Now he moved from one secluded residence to another. The Bahamas, Nicaragua, Canada, England, Mexico. Hotel rooms replaced cockpits. Curtains replaced panoramic windows. The man who had once chased speed across the sky now lived in carefully controlled indoor spaces. Even in isolation, however, Hughes could still create international news. In 1971 and 1972, writer Clifford Irving claimed that he had been secretly cooperating with Hughes on an authorized autobiography. The claim seemed almost impossible to verify. That was precisely why it worked. Hughes was so reclusive that very few people could simply ask him. Irving produced letters that appeared to support his story. A major publisher believed him. Money changed hands. Plans were made for what would have been one of the most sensational publishing events of the era. Then Hughes responded. In January 1972, he participated by telephone in a conference with journalists. His voice was heard publicly as he denied having authorized Irving's book. The very fact that Hughes had to emerge, even only as a voice on a telephone line, demonstrated how unusual his situation had become. A false autobiography had become plausible because the subject had vanished so completely from ordinary public life. The scheme eventually collapsed. Irving admitted the fraud and went to prison. The episode became one more layer in the strange mythology surrounding Howard Hughes. By now, he was both a real businessman and almost a fictional character in American culture. People knew his name. They knew his fortune. They knew stories about his behavior. But hardly anyone knew the man himself. At almost the same time, Hughes's name became useful for something far more secret. During the Cold War, an American intelligence operation sought to recover part of a Soviet submarine that had sunk deep in the Pacific Ocean. The submarine, K-129, had gone down in 1968. Recovering it from the ocean floor presented an extraordinary engineering challenge. The United States Central Intelligence Agency needed a cover story. A huge, specialized ship operating in the middle of the Pacific would attract attention. Why would anyone spend enormous sums of money constructing such a vessel? Howard Hughes offered a believable explanation. He was already associated with extravagant engineering projects. He was wealthy. He was secretive. And the idea that Hughes might finance an ambitious deep-sea mining project did not sound impossible. The specialized vessel became known as the Hughes Glomar Explorer. Publicly, it could be described as part of an effort to mine mineral deposits from the deep ocean. Secretly, it had another purpose. In 1974, the vessel attempted to lift the Soviet submarine from the ocean floor. Part of the submarine was recovered, although much of it fell back during the lifting operation. The project, often known as Project Azorian, later became public. It was one of the most remarkable intelligence and engineering operations of the Cold War. And once again, Howard Hughes's reputation had played a role. His life had become so unusual that a secret attempt to raise a Soviet submarine from the bottom of the Pacific could be hidden behind his name. Meanwhile, the structure of Hughes's business empire was changing. In 1972, the original Hughes Tool Company business was sold. The remaining interests were reorganized under a holding company called Summa Corporation. The name reportedly came from a Latin word suggesting the highest or greatest. It was an appropriate name for someone who had spent much of his life pursuing extremes. The fastest, the largest, the most ambitious, the most expensive. But by the 1970s, Hughes himself was less involved in the visible operation of these businesses. His aides and executives handled much of the practical work. His physical condition was fragile. Decades of injuries, chronic pain, poor nutrition, isolation, and medication had taken a severe toll. Photographs from his younger years had shown a tall, athletic, carefully dressed man. People who saw him near the end of his life described someone almost unrecognizable. Yet the public still remembered the earlier image. The aviator smiling beside an aircraft. The young millionaire in a suit. The Hollywood figure surrounded by stars. The pilot returning from a record flight. Both versions belong to the same life. On April 5, 1976, Howard Hughes was in Acapulco, Mexico. His health had deteriorated severely. An aircraft was arranged to take him to Houston for medical treatment. It was a strange final journey. More than 50 years earlier, a young Howard Hughes had become fascinated by airplanes. He had learned to fly. He had built racing aircraft. He had crossed the United States at record speed. He had circled the planet in less than 4 days. He had helped shape commercial aviation. He had survived multiple crashes. He had built the largest flying boat in history. And now, at the age of 70, he was once again in an airplane traveling toward Texas. Howard Hughes died during the flight. The aircraft continued to Houston. The cause of death was determined to be kidney failure, with his long period of declining health contributing to his condition. He was buried in Houston at Glenwood Cemetery, near members of his family. But death did not immediately end the mystery surrounding him. In some ways, it increased it. Hughes left no generally accepted valid final will. That created an enormous legal problem. His estate was worth billions. Who owned it? Who inherited it? Over the following years, supposed wills appeared. Some were quickly rejected. One of the most famous was connected with a Nevada service station worker named Melvin Dumar, who claimed that he had once helped a man he believed to be Hughes, and later received a document supposedly leaving him part of the fortune. The document became known as the Mormon Will. Courts ultimately rejected it. Other claims appeared as well. The legal struggle over Hughes's estate continued for years. Eventually, much of the estate passed to distant relatives. The complicated disputes seemed almost inevitable. Hughes had spent much of his adult life constructing systems through which he could control businesses from a distance. But he had not left a clear final system for what should happen when he was gone. The man who had devoted extraordinary attention to details left behind one enormous, unanswered question. His companies did not disappear. Parts of the Hughes business empire continued evolving long after his death. Hughes Aircraft remained an important aerospace and defense organization. The Howard Hughes Medical Institute eventually sold the company to General Motors in the 1980s. Different divisions later became connected with companies such as Raytheon and Boeing. Technologies developed within the broader Hughes organization contributed to radar, missiles, spacecraft, communications satellites, electronics, and telecommunications. One descendant of the Hughes electronics business became connected with satellite television services, including DirecTV. Hughes Helicopters also became part of another major aerospace company. Corporate names changed. Assets were sold. Divisions merged. The original empire fragmented. But pieces of it continued shaping American technology. The same is true of the land once occupied by Hughes Aircraft near Los Angeles. The former industrial campus in what is now Playa Vista became recognized for its historic importance. Buildings where engineers had worked on aircraft and electronics were preserved and redeveloped. The area eventually became associated with a new generation of technology and media companies. An industrial site from the age of aviation entered the age of digital technology. The H-4 Hercules survived too. For years, Hughes spent money preserving it in a climate-controlled hangar. After his death, questions arose about what should happen to the enormous aircraft. Eventually, it was moved. Today, the Hercules is preserved at the Evergreen Aviation and Space Museum in Oregon. Visitors can stand beneath its immense wings. The scale is difficult to understand from photographs alone. The wings stretch farther than a football field is wide. The aircraft that once caused congressional hearings, newspaper ridicule, engineering arguments, and public fascination now sits quietly inside a museum. It flew only once, for perhaps a minute, yet that brief flight ensured its place in aviation history. There is something very Hughes-like about that. A massive investment of time, money, labor, controversy, and ambition concentrated into one short moment when an enormous wooden aircraft lifted above the water. Was it a success? Was it a failure? The answer depends on what question is being asked. As a wartime transport system, it failed. As a technical experiment, it demonstrated possibilities. As a piece of engineering history, it became unforgettable. Howard Hughes's life contains many things that resist simple judgment in exactly the same way. His film career can also be seen from more than one angle. Hell's Angels cost far more than a normal production of its era. Its difficult creation was filled with risk. Yet its aerial photography astonished contemporary audiences. Scarface faced censorship and controversy, yet it became an influential film. The Outlaw became famous partly because of Hughes's battles over its release. His later control of RKO was far less successful. Hughes could see possibilities others missed. He could also create chaos around projects that might have benefited from restraint. Innovation and excess often appeared together. The same man who demanded aerodynamic efficiency from an airplane could spend money with remarkable inefficiency in business. The same man who valued technical precision could delay major corporate decisions. The same man who wanted complete control could eventually become dependent on a small group of aides. Contradictions like these are part of what makes historical figures interesting. Real lives rarely form neat patterns. Hughes's aviation career perhaps offers the clearest view of his abilities. He was not simply a wealthy passenger playing with airplanes. He was a skilled pilot. He understood engineering. He participated seriously in aircraft development. He set important records. His H-1 Racer represented advanced aerodynamic thinking for its period. His round-the-world flight demonstrated the growing capabilities of modern navigation and long-distance aircraft. His support for the Lockheed Constellation contributed to one of the great commercial aircraft of the post-war era. Hughes Aircraft grew into a major technological organization. These accomplishments are substantial. At the same time, his aviation story included extraordinary danger. He crashed while filming. He made emergency landings. A 1943 accident at Lake Mead killed people aboard his aircraft. The 1946 XF-11 crash nearly killed him. Again and again, Hughes placed himself at the controls of machines operating near the limits of available technology. Some people might call that courage. Others might call it recklessness. Perhaps both descriptions contain part of the truth. The world in which Howard Hughes learned to fly was very different from the world that existed when he died. When he was a child, airplanes were experimental machines. By the 1970s, Boeing 747s carried hundreds of passengers across oceans. When Hughes first experimented with radio, wireless communication seemed remarkable. By the end of his life, satellites relayed information around the globe. When Hughes began building aircraft in a rented hangar, aerospace was a young industry. By the 1970s, humans had walked on the moon. Hughes participated in that technological century. He did not create all of these transformations, of course. Thousands of engineers, scientists, pilots, workers, entrepreneurs, government officials, and companies contributed to them. But his life intersected with many of the century's major technological changes. Oil, cinema, radio, aviation, electronics, missiles, commercial airlines, satellites, deep-sea engineering, biomedical research. Few individual lives touch so many different industries. Money made much of this possible. There is no reason to ignore that fact. Howard Hughes began adulthood with financial resources most people could never imagine. The Hughes Tool Company gave him a foundation from which he could take risks unavailable to ordinary entrepreneurs. A failed film did not necessarily ruin him. An experimental aircraft could be financed privately. A company could operate for years without immediate profit. An enormous wooden airplane could continue development after others might have abandoned it. Wealth gave Hughes freedom, but money alone does not explain what he did with that freedom. Many wealthy heirs simply preserved their wealth. Hughes repeatedly placed his fortune into difficult ventures. Some worked, some failed. Some became both failures and successes at the same time. And as his wealth grew, it eventually created another kind of problem. Almost any impulse could be acted upon. A hotel could be purchased rather than left. An airline could be controlled. A movie studio could be acquired. A fleet of aircraft could be ordered. Ordinary limits disappeared. And sometimes limits are useful. The Howard Hughes of the 1930s seemed to seek the open sky. The Howard Hughes of the late 1960s seemed to avoid the outside world. It is tempting to build the story around that contrast alone. The daring young aviator becomes the isolated old billionaire. But lives are rarely so simple. Signs of Hughes's intense need for control appeared when he was young. His concerns about health and contamination had roots that long preceded Las Vegas. His ability to focus obsessively on technical problems helped produce some of his greatest achievements. The same tendency, intensified by illness and anxiety, later made ordinary life increasingly difficult. His willingness to ignore conventional advice helped him attempt extraordinary things. It also contributed to management problems. His independence allowed him to challenge powerful institutions. It also pushed him away from people who might have helped him. Qualities that appear useful in one setting can become harmful in another. History often works that way. Consider his attitude toward detail. During the production of Hell's Angels, Hughes demanded realistic aerial sequences when easier methods might have satisfied another producer. With the H-1 racer, careful aerodynamic details helped produce greater speed. With aircraft engineering, precision was essential. A small error could mean the difference between a successful flight and disaster. But in his later life, attention to detail could expand into elaborate instructions for ordinary tasks. Cleanliness procedures became increasingly complicated. Simple objects could become sources of anxiety. The mind that once examined machines for tiny sources of aerodynamic drag seemed increasingly occupied by invisible threats in everyday life. It would be inappropriate to romanticize his suffering. His later isolation was not simply eccentric billionaire behavior. Accounts from people around him describe a person whose mental and physical health had seriously deteriorated. The story is therefore not only about ambition, it is also about vulnerability. Wealth could buy privacy. It could buy entire hotels. It could pay teams of assistants. But it could not guarantee health or peace of mind. His reputation after death has reflected both sides of the story. For some people, Howard Hughes remains primarily the aviator. They remember the H-1 racer, the transcontinental record, the round-the-world flight, the Constellation, the Hercules. For others, he is the Hollywood producer, Hell's Angels, Scarface, Jane Russell, RKO. For others, he is the billionaire businessman whose investments changed Las Vegas. For others still, Howard Hughes means locked hotel rooms, closed curtains, unusual routines, and extreme isolation. All of these versions are real. None is complete by itself. Perhaps that is why his life has continued to attract writers and filmmakers. It contains the elements of several very different stories: an inventor's heir, a movie producer, a celebrity, a pilot, an industrialist, a defense contractor, an airline investor, a casino owner, a philanthropist, a recluse. Each identity seems almost large enough for an entire life. Hughes somehow accumulated them all. Popular culture has repeatedly returned to him. Biographies began appearing even while he was alive. After his death, the number increased. Contemporaries explored his businesses and private life. Films used parts of his story. In 2004, Martin Scorsese directed The Aviator, with Leonardo DiCaprio portraying Hughes during the earlier decades of his career. The film introduced a new generation to the young Hughes, rather than focusing only on the famous recluse of later years. That distinction matters. People who knew only the stories of his final years could easily forget that Howard Hughes had once been one of America's great public adventure figures. Crowds had cheered him. Presidents and government officials had recognized him. Young people followed his aviation records. Newspapers treated his flights as major events. For a time, he represented confidence in technology and the future. And perhaps no event captured that public image more clearly than his return from the 1938 world flight. Think again of New York in summer, a city already filled with traffic and noise, crowds pressing toward the streets, windows high above filled with people, pieces of paper floating down between buildings. Somewhere below, Howard Hughes and the crew of the Lockheed aircraft moving through the celebration. They had left New York, flown across oceans and continents, and returned in less than 4 days. For the people watching, the achievement suggested a future in which distance would no longer mean what it once had, a future in which aircraft could connect nations with astonishing speed, a future in which engineering could reshape the limits of everyday life. That future arrived. Perhaps not exactly as Hughes imagined it, but it arrived. Today, millions of passengers travel each day through a global aviation system built on advances that aviators of his generation helped demonstrate. The same could be said of Hughes Aircraft. The company eventually became larger and more technologically significant than the personal projects that first created it. During the post-war period, engineers there increasingly focused on electronics rather than simply airframes. Radar-guided weapons, missile systems, sensors, space technology, communications. The aerospace industry itself was changing. An airplane was no longer merely wings, an engine, and a pilot. Modern aircraft increasingly depended on electronic systems. The future would belong partly to information, to signals, to guidance, to computing, to communication. Hughes Aircraft helped participate in that transition. Eventually, large numbers of scientists and engineers worked at its Southern California facilities. By the late 1950s, the company had become one of America's major defense contractors and employed tens of thousands of people. The small rented hangar of 1932 had become an industrial research complex. That may be one of Hughes's most important business achievements. Even though he eventually became distant from daily operations, he had created the organization in which that growth could begin. There is another small detail worth remembering. Hughes did not name the famous giant aircraft the Spruce Goose. He preferred Hercules. The difference between those names almost summarizes the argument surrounding the airplane. Hercules suggests strength, scale, mythic effort. Spruce Goose sounds comic, awkward, a joke. Hughes saw the project as an engineering achievement. His critics saw an enormous wooden aircraft that had consumed public money and missed the war it was supposed to serve. Both names survived. The H-4 Hercules, the Spruce Goose. And perhaps that is appropriate. Howard Hughes often lived between admiration and ridicule. Hero and eccentric, visionary and difficult businessman, record-setting pilot and reckless risk-taker, brand of companies and source of chaos within them. He rarely fit comfortably into a single category. His influence on Las Vegas contains the same ambiguity. Hughes did not invent corporate Las Vegas. He did not single-handedly remove organized crime. He did not create the modern resort industry alone. But his investments arrived at an important moment. A nationally known billionaire with aerospace and industrial credentials began acquiring casinos and hotels. That helped make casino ownership appear more acceptable to large-scale corporate capital. Nevada laws also changed. Other investors followed. Huge resort developments appeared. The Strip continued evolving. The Las Vegas of today, dominated by enormous corporate resorts, would have been recognizable in outline to people who watched this transformation beginning in the late 1960s. And somewhere inside that transition was Howard Hughes, conducting business from a darkened hotel suite. There are many ironies in his story. The man who loved speed spent years barely leaving a room. The man who became famous through publicity eventually tried to escape public attention. The filmmaker who helped create spectacles lived his later life where almost no one could see him. The pilot who crossed the world eventually traveled mainly between secluded hotels. The industrialist who controlled thousands of employees relied on an increasingly tiny circle of aides. The billionaire whose fortune depended on advanced technology struggled with ordinary human contact. The man whose name became associated with medical research could not preserve his own health. And the man who spent so much of his life controlling details died without leaving a clear final will. History does not always provide neat lessons. Sometimes it offers contradictions instead. It would also be easy to describe Hughes only in terms of tragedy. That would be incomplete. His later years were undeniably marked by serious physical and psychological difficulties. But his life also contained moments of remarkable achievement. He lived intensely during several decades when technological boundaries were moving at extraordinary speed. He was present when cinema learned to speak. He was present when aircraft began crossing continents in hours. He helped push commercial air travel toward longer routes. His companies participated in the development of advanced aerospace electronics. His fortune helped create a biomedical research institution that outlived him. His investments influenced the development of Las Vegas. His name even became part of one of the Cold War's strangest engineering operations. This was not a quiet life. Even when Hughes himself became quiet, the consequences of his decisions continued spreading outward. If we return once more to his childhood, the shape of the story becomes almost circular. A boy in Houston is fascinated by machinery. He experiments with radio. He builds a motorized bicycle. He takes an airplane ride. His father has made a fortune from an invention designed to solve an engineering problem. The boy inherits that fortune, then spends much of his adult life searching for other engineering problems. How can a movie place the audience inside an aerial battle? How can an airplane move faster? How quickly can someone cross the United States? How quickly can an aircraft circle the world? Can passenger aircraft cross oceans efficiently? Can an enormous wooden flying boat leave the water? Can radar guide a missile? Can a specialized vessel reach something hidden thousands of meters beneath the sea? Again and again, Hughes's world revolves around machines confronting limits. Sometimes the machines succeed, sometimes they fail. Sometimes success and failure are difficult to separate. The modern world still contains traces of those experiments. The H-1 racer is preserved by the Smithsonian. The H-4 Hercules rests in Oregon. Historic buildings connected with Hughes aircraft remain in Southern California. The Howard Hughes Medical Institute continues supporting scientific research. Corporate descendants of Hughes businesses became parts of major aerospace and technology companies. Las Vegas still carries the imprint of the shift toward large corporate investment that occurred during his years there. And his life remains part of American cultural memory. Not because he was simply rich. History contains many wealthy people whose names are now barely remembered. Hughes remains interesting because of what he tried to do with wealth, talent, ambition, fear, independence, and control. His story contains enormous possibility and enormous limitation. There is one more way to think about Howard Hughes. For much of his life, he seems to have been pursuing distance. As a young man, distance was something to overcome. Los Angeles to New York to Paris, Paris to Moscow, across Siberia, across Alaska, around the planet. Distance was a challenge measured in miles and hours. Later, distance became something else. Time from employees, ext from journalists, pause distance from strangers, language from public life, true John-human contact. The young Hughes conquered geographical distance. The older Hughes created personal distance. Perhaps that contrast is one reason his story feels so unusual. The same word can describe two very different journeys. On that July day in 1938, when his Lockheed returned to New York after flying around the world, Howard Hughes was 32 years old. Much of his extraordinary life still lay ahead. The Hercules had not yet been built. The XF-11 had not yet crashed. Hughes Aircraft had not yet become a giant defense contractor. He had not yet taken control of RKO. The Howard Hughes Medical Institute did not yet exist. Las Vegas was still decades away. His long years of isolation were impossible for the cheering crowds to imagine. At that moment, they saw a young pilot stepping out of an airplane after doing something that seemed almost impossible. And perhaps Hughes himself looked toward the future in much the same way. There would always be another machine, another company, another project, another record, another problem waiting to be solved. Then the years passed. The machines became larger. The companies became larger. The fortune became larger. The circle of people around him became smaller. Finally, the rooms themselves seemed to become his world. But outside those rooms, the organizations he had created continued moving. Aircraft were built. Engineers worked. Hotels operated. Scientists conducted experiments. Satellites were designed. Businesses changed hands. Cities changed. Technology changed. The world continued. And that may be the quietest part of Howard Hughes's story. No matter how much control one person gathers, history continues beyond them. Companies become something their founders never expected. Buildings find new uses. Machines enter museums. Fortunes pass to others. Ideas are taken up by people who never knew the person who began them. A life becomes a story, and a story becomes part of history. Today, Howard Hughes can seem almost like several people blended into one. A Texas boy fascinated by machines, a 19-year-old millionaire, a young Hollywood producer, a handsome celebrity, a fearless aviator, a demanding engineer, a record-breaking pilot, a defense industrialist, an airline owner, a movie studio chief, a casino investor, a medical philanthropist, a secretive billionaire, and finally, an aging man almost completely separated from the outside world. It is difficult to decide which image is the real Howard Hughes. Perhaps the answer is that all of them are. People change. Circumstances change. Health changes. Success changes people, and failure changes them too. The Hughes who crossed the world in 1938 could not remain 32 forever. The applause eventually faded. The aircraft landed. The parade ended. And another part of life began. Still, somewhere in museums and archives, those earlier moments remain. A photograph of Hughes beside an airplane, the streamlined silver body of the H-1 racer, the broad wooden wings of the Hercules, old film footage from Hollywood, a Lockheed Constellation wearing TWA colors, photographs of ticker tape falling through New York streets, buildings where engineers once worked on radar and missiles, destructions carrying instructions from a man hidden inside a hotel suite, Each object preserves only a fragment. Together, they form the outline of a life that moved through some of the most dramatic technological changes of the 20th century. Howard Hughes was 70 years old when his final flight left Mexico for Houston in April 1976. His life had begun in Texas during the first decade of powered flight. It ended in a world of jetliners, satellites, computers, nuclear submarines, and spacecraft. Between those two moments, he had participated in that transformation in ways both impressive and deeply complicated. He had experienced great wealth, great fame, extraordinary achievement, serious failure, physical pain, isolation, public admiration, public criticism, and finally, an almost complete disappearance from the world that had once watched his every move. There is no need to turn that life into a simple moral. History is usually more interesting when we allow people to remain complicated. Howard Hughes could be visionary and impractical, brave and reckless, generous in one moment and controlling in another, technically insightful and organizationally difficult, publicly glamorous and privately troubled. He could build machines designed to cross enormous distances while gradually losing the ability to cross the distance between himself and other people. And now, as our story begins to quiet, perhaps we can leave Howard Hughes not in the darkened rooms of his final years, but somewhere earlier, perhaps in an airplane. The engine is steady. Below him is a landscape stretching toward the horizon. Ahead there is another city, another airfield, another destination. The aircraft moves through open sky. For a few hours there are no studios to manage, no hotels to buy, no hearings, no legal battles, no business empire. Only instruments, engines, wings, air, and distance. The things that fascinated him from the beginning. A machine moving forward, a problem to solve, a horizon that seems just a little farther away. Howard Hughes spent much of his life trying to reach beyond the limits that surrounded him. Sometimes he succeeded, sometimes he did not. But the attempt carried him from the oil fields of Texas to Hollywood, from Hollywood to the skies above America, from aviation records to aerospace laboratories, from Las Vegas hotels to secret Cold War projects, and finally into history. More than a century after his birth, the airplanes, institutions, companies, buildings, films, and stories connected with his name remain scattered across the American landscape. Quiet reminders of an extraordinary and complicated life. And somewhere among them is the memory of a young man looking toward the sky and wondering just how far a machine might carry him. For now, there is nothing more you need to remember. The airplanes can rest in their museums. The old movie theaters can grow quiet. The lights of Las Vegas can fade into the distance. The engines can become softer and softer. And the long journey of Howard Hughes can simply drift away into history. A boy fascinated by machines. A young man in Hollywood. A pilot crossing continents. A silver airplane moving through the clouds. A giant wooden flying boat rising briefly above the water. A vast business empire. Closed curtains. And finally, one last flight toward home. The story has traveled a long way, and now it can slowly come to rest.